Art Markman, excuse me, Art Markman and Robert Duke, both professors from UT Austin. I asked them how they wanted to be introduced, and Art said that he's a psychologist that's a musician, and Bob said he's a musician that's a psychologist. Now, if I were to start reading from their CVs, they wouldn't have a chance to talk because it would take too long. But they are delightful. They have an NPR show in Austin. They teach all kinds of different things about learning, psychology, the human dimension. And tonight, they're going to discuss happiness.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you very much, Bill, for that kind introduction. Let me thank not only Bill Winslade, but the Moody Foundation and the Institute for Medical Humanities and all the organizations that make this talk possible. I have to tell you, we've never given a talk in a venue like this. This is very weird because at our angle, we can only see your heads. So you're safe. Whatever you're doing under the chair, we can't. We have no idea. So you're good to go. Just have at it. Let me just say how happy Art and I are to be here, to be a part of a lecture series that has so many distinguished speakers visiting Galveston and about topics that all of us are interested in, our brains and the brains of our loved ones and the people with whom we interact, some of which are inscrutable and others are very understandable. So when Bill asked us what we wanted to talk about, Art suggested happiness would be a perfect place to start.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, actually, I was just thinking this on the way in, that this is actually the third time that we've spoken in a movie theater.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, first time in an IMAX though, and so yeah, this perspective is fascinating. I'm going to be dreaming about this for a long time. So we did want to talk a little bit about happiness because it's a sort of fascinating topic if you think about mood in general. That one of the first questions people ask is, well, you know, how happy should I be? And I think the first thing we have to make clear when you talk about happiness and well-being, there's actually been a lot of study of this over the last 25 years in psychology. The history of psychology, if you think about it, you go way back to the late 19th century, and people were mostly focused on what goes wrong with people, right? So you know, if you think about Freud spent a lot of time worrying about what went wrong with people, and from then on there was a lot of focus on the medical issues that come up with people's psychology. And starting about 25 years ago, there was a movement towards what's called positive psychology, which is the idea that we should spend some amount of time understanding what goes right with people. What does it mean to actually live a good life and be happy so that we can get a sense not just of what goes wrong, but what the good things are. And I'm just going to say one thing to get started with this, which is one of the things that emerges from all of this work, is that if you look at individual differences in happiness, okay, so and we all know at any given moment some people are happier than others, what we see is that you can account for about half of the difference between people on the basis of what we could think of as genetic factors, that there really are some people who are just happy people and some people who are not so happy people. And people tend to drift back towards that set point. So that's half of what's going on. And then that other half seems to involve two different factors, one of which is the ups and downs of what's going on with you more recently, right? So we all have good days and bad days where we are either a little bit happier or a little less happy than we've been in general. And then there's about 30% in there that is the stuff we have a lot of control over that can move us in a longer term a little bit higher or lower than where our set point would be by really trying to adapt our life to what we know about how to live in a way that would make you happy.
Yeah, and you know, all of us as individuals, not just because of the data Art just mentioned, but we have different interpretations of what happiness actually means, right? I mean, many people who are loud like we are and buoyant and laugh a lot see people who are somewhat more subdued And we may think that they're not very happy because
They're not.
Yeah. And I think many people find a great deal of satisfaction being less buoyant and less loud. So the expectation that what our behaviors are like when we're happy should match the way other people behave when they're happy is generally not the case. We all have different ways of interpreting our lives, of course, and how that manifests itself in our behavior and the way we interact with other people differs based not only on the genetic factors Art talked about, but also what our history has been over time in the way we just correspond with the world when we interact with other people.
So Tolstoy was wrong. Actually, not even every happy person is the same.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you know, one of the things that's interesting to think about, I think most people would say, I would rather be happy than not. But it's interesting to think, what are the really critical features that lead one to be happy? I think one of the most remarkable findings when positive psychologists, so-called, study happiness across populations is how people who exist in what are very different circumstances can have equivalent levels of happiness. And the expectation often, especially for someone who is not happy, is that if I just had the circumstances that that other person has, then I would be happy. But actually, that's often not the case. In fact, more often than not, it's not the case. Because all of us interpret the experiences that we have, and those interpretations have as much to do with our self-perceptions of happiness as the circumstances themselves.
Yeah. And so one of the themes for tonight is going to be that human beings have a remarkable capacity to construe situations as they choose to. That is, we get to decide how we want to think about things. And so we all know those people who can find the silver lining in every cloud, as well as those people who can find the cloud in every silver lining. And so we do have a remarkable amount of control over what we choose to focus on. Now, one of the things that's important to know about happiness is that when you're in a positive mood, you tend to focus on things that are relatively positive. The world looks a little bit brighter when you're in a good mood. And when you're not feeling great, you notice all of the things that are going wrong, which means that your moods have a tendency to perpetuate themselves. Right? Because you will, if you're feeling down, you look around the world, you can find ample evidence that you ought to be down. Right? But one of the reasons that this matters is that it means that if you want to try to lift your mood, at least temporarily, from a position of being down, one of the things you can start to do is just to start looking for the positive things that are out there in the world that might make you a little happier, and allow that more virtuous cycle to begin to take over.
Yeah, and it's important whenever we give a talk about anything having to do with emotion or cognition to emphasize this point. From inside our own consciousness, it feels to us like we have a mind, and there's a mind that lives in our brain, and our brain's carried around in this skull and our bodies. And that separateness is an illusion, right? Our minds are our brains, and our brains are a part of our bodies. So if we treat all of those things separately, and we think about physical well-being and physical health as something entirely separate than emotional well-being and emotional health, we're going to misconstrue many of the circumstances in which we find ourselves, right? I mean, if you think about one of the most critical features of just human functioning is sleeping. We have probably the most underslept population that's ever been, right? I mean, we count on the idea. In fact, we even are laudatory toward people who say, well, I don't need any sleep. You know, I can work on 4 hours a night. Well, no, you can't. You might say that, but actually you're not functioning at an optimal level if you're not sleeping. And that change in your physiology has an effect on how you perceive the world. And as Art says, if you're already in a mood where you're a little bit down, things that seemingly are unhappy, as you define them, loom large in your perception. And it takes a conscious effort to actually say, you know, rather than just continuing to perseverate thinking about these things that are unhappy, which are going to increase my level of unhappiness, I can actually tell myself and actually practice, and I'll come back to the word practice a little bit later, I can actually practice thinking about things that are more positive, and all the things that we hear in popular songs and everything about accentuate the positive, and those are true. I mean, they're psychologically true. I mean, it was like, it's like, well, some lyricist made that up. Well, actually, no, that's the way we actually work. And getting to that point where you have an understanding like that as an individual, and you start to think about, what is it that's genuinely affecting my mood? Is this circumstance that I find myself in, am I just responding in a way that's inevitable? Or am I thinking about this in a way that I could think about differently? And is my body in a condition that allows me the mental flexibility and the emotional flexibility to adjust what I'm thinking and how I'm feeling in a way that I can somewhat control?
Now, Bob says, this idea of accentuate the positive, that this can really work. But some of you are thinking to yourself, yeah, but if I accentuate the positive and I'm feeling down, well, I'm not being authentic to the mood that I'm having right now. And shouldn't I actually allow myself to feel the thing that I'm feeling right now? Well, one of the things that's important to realize is it's not the case that everything emanates from the brain outward, where somehow if I'm down, I now have to comport myself in a way that says I'm down. And one of the things that Bob talks about a lot on our radio show that I think is important is actually there's a tremendous amount of value sometimes with trying to work your mood from the outside back in rather than the inside out. So when you're feeling down, okay, actually paste a smile on your face. Maybe not that smile, but a smile. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, there's actually a couple of reasons. The first, because there is a bit of a physiological connection between the act of smiling and the circuitry in your brain that's associated with positive mood. So you actually will feel ever so slightly better when you smile, just because you're smiling and your brain knows that that's something that's associated with positive mood. Now, this reinforces itself in a second way, which is everyone else's brains are wired to mirror what you're doing, right? These imitation mechanisms that we have, and I'm gonna resist the idea of calling these mirror neurons, which some people have talked about, because while there are some neurons that seem to fire in certain animals when they see a particular for example, facial expression on the part of another animal, it's actually not 100% clear what those things are doing. But what we do know is from birth, human beings are remarkably good at imitation. And so if you walk around the world smiling, people will smile back at you. And you'll actually forget that the reason they're smiling at you is because you're smiling. And so now you look around and you think, wow, there's all these happy people around. It's so great to be happy just like them. And you caused it because you were smiling. And actually it works the other way. If you insist on walking around with a frown, you will have all these people who are walking around looking at you. And now you'll be thinking, wow, the world must really be depressing today, when it's really just people throwing back at you a little bit of your own facial expression.
And let's think a little bit about how the brain does this, right? Brains are amazing association-making machines. So things that occur in close proximity in time tend to become associated with one another. And that's true if two things in our environment, or it doesn't be two, it could be more than two, but things in our environment co-occur, they tend to become associated in our brains over many repetitions of that. Things that co-occur from different parts of our memory tend to become associated. Things in the environment that excite things in our memory tend to become associated when they happen, when they co-occur over time. And the reason that's an important thing to think about is it helps explain Art's example about making facial expressions that don't seem sincere, with the idea that that actually has the potential to influence emotional feeling. Because typically we think of a smile in response to a happy occurrence, right? Something nice happens to us, we hear somebody tell a good joke, and the smile seems a reaction to that. And it doesn't really, yeah, right, thank you. And it doesn't really occur to us that the reverse can also be true because of the associations that have been made in the brain. And Art's point about actually acting in a way that one would act if you were happy and feeling good about what you were doing actually works the other way towards your emotions, because those association pathways are not unidirectional, right? They go in both directions.
Yeah. Now I want to return to something that we started with. I pointed out at the beginning that part of what we know is that there really does seem to be an overall happiness set point. So there are some people out there who are naturally really happy people and some people who are naturally somewhat less happy. One of the interesting things that happens is that regardless of the events that happen to you in your life, you actually tend to return back to that baseline. And I want to talk about two elements of that for a moment. The first is just to point out that we shouldn't be afraid to put ourselves in situations in which we might fail at something. Because a lot of times people feel like, well, if I try something and then I fail, I'm going to feel really bad about that, and that'll make me a sad person. There was a really beautiful study that got done by Dan Gilbert and Tim Wilson. They took advantage of the fact that they were hanging out with university professors. And if you know any university professors, you know that one of the big milestones in the academic life is the decision about whether you get tenure or not. So approximately 7 years into being a faculty member, there's this huge evaluation. Afterwards, you either have a job at that university for life, more or less, or not, and you have to go, okay? And so this is a momentous thing, and so what they did was they caught a bunch of faculty members who were being evaluated for tenure that year, about 6 months before the tenure decision, and they said to them, all right, how happy do you think you will be 6 months after finding out whether you got tenure or not, if you got tenure? And people would rate that, and they generally rated themselves as being, I'd be really happy. And then they asked them the same question, but what if you found out you didn't get tenure? And people said, well, I'd be really sad 6 months later. And then they waited a year, and then they asked all the same people, well, how did it go? So some people got tenure, some didn't. And then how happy are you? And what they found, and this is the interesting thing, the people everyone was on average equally happy regardless of whether they'd gotten tenure or not 6 months before. So if I'd asked you like a day after the decision, I'm sure that the people who got tenure were happier than the ones who didn't. But over a period of 6 months, actually everyone seems to return back to their baseline, right? All of these other things happen. And I think it's important to recognize that when you walk down the street and you see some people who are really happy with smiles on their faces and some people who may not be as happy, that each life, if you could reach into their life history, that each life has been touched by a little tragedy, it's been touched by some happy, wonderful times, and that everyone has a mix of that in their life history, and we all eventually return back to largely what is that set point that we have.
Yeah, and one of the things that happens as we age, and as a 63-year-old, I can see my perspective is changing. I'm just starting to grow up now. But one of the things that we realize, thank you, one of the things we realize when we're around very young children is their time scale that they're operating on is like incredibly short, right? I mean, joy is joy like right now. And then 5 minutes from now, there could be tragedy that's right now, that's unmitigated because of something that didn't happen the way you want to have it. And I can see all of you are smiling who have young children or have been born. You say, yeah, right, I have that. Well,
Works with teenagers, too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the most wonderful things about the human brain, well, there are a lot of wonderful things about the human brain. But one of the things about the human brain is that we have time machines in our heads, right? We can think into the future and into the past. And one of the things that maturing individuals, of which I count myself one, is that you realize that the arc of your life, even though, and this gets back to what Art was saying a minute ago, even though there are oscillations in how happy and how sad you are, right? Over time, there's a sort of an evenness to it, you know? One of the undergraduate programs I work with at Texas is with undergraduates who are preparing to be teachers in public schools. And the students whom I worry about the most is after they have their first experience in front of a class, and they come back and see me, and they say, oh, Dr. Duke, I knew this is what I wanted to do my whole life. This is exactly what I should be doing. I had the best day. The kids were great. They just loved the lesson. I'm worried about that kid. Because I know, it wasn't as good as you think it was, right? And the reason I worry about them, because I know in like 3 days, they're going to come back and say, I really am in the wrong major. I got to get out of here. This is terrible. And the thing that I try to get my students to think about is that when you think you were brilliant, you probably weren't that brilliant. And when you thought you're just the worst thing that anybody's ever seen, you probably weren't that bad either. Because we don't go from brilliant to idiotic in 24-hour spans. We might do idiotic things, and we might do brilliant things from time to time, but basically, who we are and what our life circumstances are not that rapidly changeable for most of us in most of our life experience. Now, this doesn't deny the fact that there are tragedies and there are great successes that people are fortunate to experience from time to time. But nevertheless, our interpretations of them have a great deal to do with how much they affect our sense of well-being. Because that student who thinks they're a brilliant teacher on Tuesday and that they're in the wrong major on Thursday, and then the next Monday they have another good experience and think they're brilliant again, that's a picture of mental ill health, right? Because what allows human beings like us to feel some sense of safety and security is our ability to anticipate what's going to happen. And if we're able to define things in such a way that what happens from day to day doesn't seem drastically different from one day to the next, well, that's a much more comfortable place to be, right? Especially when we live in a contemporary society, which I still marvel at, especially hearing about things that go on in other parts of the world. Is it basically, I know I'm going to be safe when I go from my home to my office every day. I know I can walk around in the evening around my neighborhood and I'm not threatened. I mean, that feeling of expecting things to be the way they have been is something that's stabilizing for emotion. And the more unpredictable all of that becomes, the harder it is to maintain a sense of positivity and well-being.
And this stability is one of the reasons why people do such a bad job at predicting which actions they should take that might make them a little bit happier. So, for example, we all know people who say, you know what, I'm going to go out and buy a new car, and that car is going to make me happy, or a TV, or some other thing, right? And the reason that we misestimate this is because in the moment that you get some new thing, a shirt, pair of shoes, whatever it is, everyone's got their thing, in the moment that you buy it, you are kind of happy, although some people immediately experience what's called buyer's remorse because they realize they may have parted with slightly more cash than they wanted to. And we'll get back to that issue in a second. But one of the things that happens is in the moment that you make some purchase, you think, whoa, this is really cool. Now I have one of these. Okay? The problem is that very quickly you end up on what Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize about 15 years ago, Danny called that the hedonic treadmill. And the idea behind the hedonic treadmill is you get this new thing, and for a moment you're excited by it because I got this thing, and then it just becomes part of your stuff. And very quickly you adapt to it, and now your life just involves this pair of shoes or this car or whatever it is. And now you're back to where you were, and now there's something else you want. You think, well, if I just got that, now I'll be happy. And that's the treadmill part, right? So buying stuff does not make you happy in the long run. So you might think, oh, well, so the Beatles were more or less right. Money can't buy you love, happiness, or whatever. But it's not completely true. Actually, you can spend your money in ways that will make you happier. And there's two ways now that research has been suggesting will make you happier. The first is to pay people to do things you don't want to do. Okay? Because having to do stuff you hate is bad for your sense of well-being. So if you have a little extra money and you can find something you hate to do, like I don't like cutting the grass. I have the Austin allergies where, my whole head feels like it's going to explode. And so if I don't have to cut my grass, I'm a happier person. Paying somebody else to cut the grass is a big win for everyone. Okay? And so,
Especially Art's wife.
especially, exactly, right, and the dogs and everything. So that can make you happier, paying people to do stuff you don't want to do. The second thing that makes you happier is to buy experiences rather than stuff. Because as Bob pointed out, we have this remarkable mental ability to time travel, right? So we can actually think back to wonderful things that we've done, and those wonderful memories make you feel better. They make you feel happier. And so buy a trip somewhere, buy an experience, right? Or don't spend any money and come to a talk like this one, right? And either way, you now have this happy memory that you can now call on when you need something to help make you happier. So spending your money in those ways actually can benefit your overall happiness.
And also, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the people we surround ourselves with have a tremendous influence on how we perceive the world around us. I was just talking to my undergraduate students just on Monday in my class. I surround myself with very effectively manipulative people who share my value system. Just think about that for a minute. You know, sometimes, I mean, I love my job. I love being a college professor. I think it's like the best job in the world. But I have to serve on committees, which is what they pay me for. I teach and do research for free. They pay me a lot of money to be on committees. But I'll come home from a terrible committee meeting one day, and I'll start saying to my wife, oh, God, you would not believe this meeting. And we spent an hour, and we got through the first 2 items on the agenda. We had to spend the next 20 minutes figuring out when we're going to meet to get to the rest of the agenda. And my wife will give me about a minute of that. And she says, so you're going to quit the committee? You're going to chair it? You're going to take it over so you can... You know. Because what she's telling me is, we're not going to talk about this anymore. Now, I know what she's doing, and she knows that I know what she's doing, but I realize that a very well-meaning spouse, who was not as effectively manipulative as my wife is, would say, really, honey, oh, that's just terrible. Tell me more about it. And then, well, listen, and you know, Tim is on this committee. Oh, Tim, really? Oh, I know you hate him. Yes. And this could go on for 30 minutes, right? Now, the thing is, my wife, if that were my wife, which is not my wife, would be thinking she's being sympathetic and kind. But, well, maybe so, but she's not helping me, right? Because what we're doing is not redirecting my attention to something productive.
You're wallowing.
Right. We're just wallowing in my crappy mood, right? And I think that's something that we often don't recognize, is that with the best of intentions, trying to help people who don't necessarily feel good, we often help them remain in an unhappy state. Now, this isn't to say, you know, somebody comes into your house and they say, look, I really feel really bad, and you start putting on Happy Days Are Here Again on the radio and start trying to cheer them up. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a point at which, clearly, there's nothing more to be said about this that's going to make anything better. And now it's time to redirect our energies to another thing. That's not an easy thing to do for people for whom that's not a regular practice, but it is a tremendous influence on how each of us thinks about herself or himself in terms of what our life experiences are.
Yeah. Now, another aspect of what makes you feel good in the moment, which is an interesting one, is that there's a lot of evidence that the faster you think in any given moment, the better you feel. Because here's a little known fact, which is that the moods you experience, the feelings you experience at any given moment are actually a reflection of how your motivational system is doing. And your motivational system, it involves lots of mechanisms that are buried deep inside the brain. So, you know, if you've come to the talks in this series in the past, you know you've been hearing a lot about brains. So you know that the human brain looks a little bit like a pair of boxing gloves that are set the wrong way around. And they're gray in color on the outside, and so that's the gray matter. And then you dig down in the brain a little bit, it turns from gray in color to white in color. That's that white matter, those insulated nerve fibers that are carrying information from one area of the brain to the next. Now, if you keep on digging down into a brain, you eventually come to these other gray matter structures, part of what's called the basal ganglia. And part of what's going on in those brain structures is that they are part of the brain's motivational system. Now, it's important to note that motivational system involves a lot of circuits way deep in the brain. And the reason that matters is because those circuits are not particularly well connected to the cortex, to the outer part of the brain, where lots of our wonderful functions like our ability to tell stories are located. And so actually we have remarkably little insight into why we do the things that we do, right? This is why people need therapy. And I don't mean like the specific things that go wrong that make people need therapy, but you could ask yourself the question, why is therapy a thing? Why do people have to go to somebody else to tell them what they're doing and how they're feeling when they should know themselves? And the answer is because these motivational centers of the brain are not well connected with the rest of the brain. So you actually need a trained professional to sit there and help you reason through why you're doing the things that you're doing. So how does that motivational circuitry communicate with the rest of the brain? It does that through the feelings that you have. When things are going well for you motivationally, you feel pretty good. When they're not going so well, you don't feel good, you feel bad. And then the more invested you are in the situation, the stronger the feeling that you have, okay? And so roughly, your feelings are giving you a readout of how your motivational system is doing at any given moment, okay? Now, why would this matter? Well, because if I can make my motivational system feel like it's doing better, I can lift my mood. So how could I do that? Well, one of the things I can try to do is to think faster. Because the faster I'm thinking, the more my motivational system begins to think, you're doing really well, feel good. Now, one way to do that is to have a really good conversation with someone. Because when you have a really great conversation, the information is flowing back and forth really quickly, your motivational system is going, yeah. And then you get this really great feeling. But you can do this in the absence of another person. So for example, put on some happy music. And what is happy music? Happy music is generally fast music, right? When the climactic sad scene of the romantic comedy comes on, you know, you don't get songs like na 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 na, right? Why don't you don't get that? It's really slow music to make you feel sad. Why does the happy music help? Because your brain has to keep up with it. It has to think fast in order to keep up with the music. It actually lifts your mood. So you put yourself in a situation in which you have to think fast, and you actually will raise your mood.
Yeah, and you know, I think all of us recognize as well that there are sometimes feeling bad feels good a little bit. You know, I mean, I'm sad about things from time to time, and I don't want to make the sadness go away as quickly as possible. I mean, I think about loved ones I've lost in the past, and you know, that there's a little sadness about that that's actually nice to experience from time to time. So I don't want to give the impression, and I don't think we've done this, but just that it needs to be said, that like happiness is the goal, you know, and you should be elated as many hours of the day as possible. I mean, certainly our moods are part of our evolutionary history. I mean, there are reasons for mood differences, and Art just described a big part of it, is that our moods let us know how things are going, right? But what's interesting about this, and the lack of communicability between the frontal lobes, where we think of as our conscious selves, and those deeper parts of the brain, is that this part of the brain can't tell the other part of the brain what to do, right? I mean, when other people see us in a bad mood, or that we're in a snit or whatever, and somebody just says, snap out of it, yeah, nice, okay, good. How do you do that? And the answer is, you can't tell yourself to do that. Because those parts of the brain, as Art's pointing out, don't communicate. So what's the only pathway to do that? You have to experience your way out of it. And because we're human beings, unlike most organisms, we can actually control our environment, right? We can actually control what music is on in the environment. We can control what people we're interacting with. We can control whether we're in a dark room or outside in the sun. And the ability to make those decisions allows us to get to the parts of our brain that we can't speak to directly through verbalizations from our conscious selves. And just to add on to Art's point about our brains being good storytellers, we love good stories. And one of my favorite sort of jokey things we say in psychology is that one of the main reasons the frontal lobes evolved was to make up post hoc rationalizations for what we do. So after we've already done them, our brain makes up a good story about why that happened. Well, again, that has an advantage to it too, because it allows us to make stories that weave together things that we have in our experience that actually lead us to more positive outcomes.
Now, I want to point out that one of the themes, this lecture series that we're a part of is looking at the brain across the lifespan. And theoretically, while we're talking about happiness tonight, one of the focus of this is supposed to be in part on adolescence. And so I feel like we should say something about what's going on in adolescence related to happiness. And so one of the things we need to think about is that the human motivational system during adolescence is very confused, the motivational
As
system.
is every other part of it.
Right. And the reason for that is because there's just a tremendous amount going on physiologically and also from a lifespan perspective. So I want to divide this into two pieces. One, there's a lot of research in psychology on what are called life tasks. So at different points in your life, you have different life tasks, okay? So in your early 20s, you're establishing a career, maybe creating a family, right? In adolescence, your life task is to separate yourself as an individual from the rest of your family so that you can begin to become a unique member of the community and not just someone who's lumped in with the rest of your family. And so you have this life task that is inherently about separation from other people, even though that connection to other people is so important for well-being, right? So one of the reasons why adolescents are often not the happiest people on planet Earth is because the life task that they have for themselves in that moment is one that requires pulling away from a lot of the support structure that has been so important up to that point. Now, add into that an influx of hormones that create lots of goals for adolescents, many of which they can't really act on. So remember, the motivational system is giving you a readout of how well it's doing at that moment. And now we throw in all of these goals that are often about sex, that for a variety of reasons, particularly in our social world as it's structured in the 21st century, says, I know what your body's telling you to do, but no. And then no. So what you're saying to the teenage motivational system is a lot of no. Now, what are you doing? You are blocking a goal that the motivational system has. And I've just told you that when the motivational system is not getting what it wants, it doesn't feel good. So on top of this life task that's creating separations, we also have a tremendous amount of physiology that is causing frustration in the motivational system in ways that also influence well-being. And now one last piece of this, just for fun, I also mentioned that the strength of the emotional reaction you have is a reflection of how deeply engaged that motivational system is with the environment. And so all of these hormones, all of this need to separate tends to create very deep investment in the goals, which means that the typical teenager not only experiences a little bit more on the negative side than the positive side, but they do it deeply, right? There's tremendous motivational investment, which is why when you hang out with a teenager for a long period of time, it is emotionally exhausting. Because when things have gone well for a moment, they're not just good, they're great, like Tony the Tiger used to say. And when things are not going well, they aren't just bad, they are awful. I just had the worst day ever, right? And so we have to understand that the teenage brain is being put in a situation in which it is forced to ride life's roller coaster.
And it's important to think about the fact that all of these aspects of our brains evolved at a very different time and in a very different circumstance than we all find ourselves, right? I mean, there are all kinds of experiences that we have now in contemporary society that exploit, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways, all of the tendencies that at one time in our evolutionary history were tremendously advantageous, right? I mean, right now, in fact, I have a little confession to make. Art and I were a little hungry this afternoon, and we're having a little coffee with Bill, and I wanted a snack. And the waitress came up, this lovely person who was taking care of our table, and I said, do you have anything in the kitchen? She said, how about some fries? And I said, yeah, fries. Now, fries never occurred to me, but just the mention of fries. So she brought us each our own plate of fries so we wouldn't fight.
Salt,
and fat. Right. But so what are our brains doing? What's with fries, right? For fries have fat and salt. And if there was a little chocolate to dip them in, so much the better, right? And the thing is, when our brains were evolving our appetitive responses, what was in short supply, right? Fats and salts and sweets. And so what our brains learned to do at that time is, whenever you come across something like that, you need to put as much of that in your face as you possibly can, never imagining that one day there would be a fast food restaurant on every block with all
people
of the
who would
salt.
bring you plates of fries.
Right, and nice hotels would bring you plates of fries as grown people. But I think
Made us happy, though.
Exactly. But I mean, the same thing holds true when Art's thinking about adolescence, right? Adolescence now in contemporary society is very different than it was in early human history, right? I mean, adolescents continue to live in our homes until they go to college, and then we still pay for them, for God's sake. And this goes on for a very long time. This was not the case. And at that time, we had to push everything faster because the human lifespan was so much shorter than it was now, than it is now, right? So all of the time scales that human beings evolved to function within have now changed. So all of this stuff is now influencing, I just have to say one other thing, because I always try to say this because I'm a real fan of sleep. Just the way we treat adolescents in terms of sleep, right? I mean, we set school start times at a time when it's convenient for parents to take kids to school so they can get to work, right? And the fact that adolescents want to stay up late and sleep late is a function of their biology. It's not a function of culture. And so we're working against that very thing when we're dragging them out of bed when they really should be sleeping some more, and trying to make them go to bed when they want to stay awake. And as I said about 30 minutes ago, sleep is a tremendous regulator of mood. So much so that when we tend not to sleep well, we have fragmented sleep or insufficient sleep, what happens is that we tend to remember things that were more negative from the recent past than when we're well slept. Now, that's a dramatic thing. And if you know people who, don't sleep very much because they're a teenager or whatever other reason, and they tend to focus on things that are very negative about what happened yesterday and what slight they experienced and that kind of thing, a lot of that is a function of the fact that they're not sleeping. And one of the things that I think we all have sort of responsibility to do for the people that we love and the people that we care about is reminding ourselves and them that our bodies and our brains and our minds are not three separate things. They're all interconnected intimately, such that what happens to one affects the other. We all know that being sad, having some emotional loss can affect our physical well-being and vice versa. And the more we think about the fact that all of those pieces of what we think about as the human experience all work together, the better able we are, I think, to adapt to the circumstances in which we find ourselves and engender a sense of happiness that sort of sustains us from one day to the next.
All right. And in a second, we're going to take questions from people, and I'm warning you now so you can prepare your questions. But I do want to say one other thing, since this really is a lecture series about the brain. One of the things that I hope has come through from this discussion is that the factors that lead people to be happy or unhappy are actually complex and have much more to do with our interaction with the world than they do with some single switch that we flip in order to be happy or unhappy. And the reason that this is important is because a lot of times when when we talk about happiness, people immediately say, well, what about dopamine? Or what about serotonin? And these are chemicals that are in the brain that, you know, if we could just wash the brain in one of these chemicals, that would fix everything, okay? And the answer is no, okay, for a variety of reasons, but I'll just give you one to ponder as you get ready to ask your questions. And that is, if you look at the medications that we use for depression, which are designed both to alleviate the symptoms of depression and potentially also to lift mood, one of the classes of drugs that we use is drugs like Prozac that are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What's important in that word? The two words that are important in there are serotonin. That's one of the chemicals in the brain, and then the rest of the words are basically telling you that it increases the influence of serotonin over time, because the serotonin doesn't get sucked back into the cells or reuptaken by the cells. Now, here's the deal. If anyone has ever known someone who's taken one of these drugs, one of the great mysteries of these drugs is that they are not what are called day one, dose one response medications, which means the day you take it, nothing happens. And then the second day you take it, nothing happens. And then the third day you take it, nothing happens. But over the period of about 2 weeks, you realize that your mood has changed. Okay? So the reason I'm raising this is because it's just a simple demonstration of the fact that if it were just a matter of a particular chemical influencing the way the brain works, then it shouldn't take 2 weeks for you to see this change. It should just happen immediately. Like, if I wouldn't take Benadryl if it took 2 weeks for it to work, right? Because my nose is running now. Okay, so the brain, the mood states of the brain are complicated, and they involve circuitry that really has much more to do with the way the motivational system is working rather than some particular chemical bath that the brain is involved in.
And just to close off our part of just yapping about this, there's something about practice, and we're both musicians, so practice is something we understand. You know, we have ways of responding to things that happen in the world around us, and we have ways that we tend to become habits of the way we respond to things that happen around us. And what's interesting is how the things that we practice, I mean, the things that we repeatedly do, tend to become the ways we respond, right? I've learned, now that I'm an older person, I never send an angry email after dinner. I just know not to do that. I write the angry email after dinner because it feels really good, and I write great emails, right? But then I sleep, and then I wake up the next day, and most of the emails I don't send, and the ones I do send, I change them a little bit. But the reason I say all that is that's a habit that I've gotten into that has made my life happier, right? Because that little change...
And mine.
Yes, and ours. Because one of the things that has happened is that now something that would have been a habit, right? I've taught myself a new habit, right? I've taught myself a new thing that I can control, that then influences the circumstances that I find myself in. And that's something that I think is undervalued. We imagine that we go through life responding to stuff, not often enough thinking that we can choose how we respond. But if we're going to respond effectively in the future, we have to consciously practice doing that. And that's probably a good place to call Art Talk to an end and invite questions from anybody who'd like to ask a question. We don't have someone running around with a microphone, so you have to speak right up. So
Yeah. Stand up, say something, we'll repeat the question for everyone. Stunned you all into submission.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Talking about things that have happened to childhood friends or lifelong friends, and you reminisce now that you're up in age.
Yeah.
And when you reminisce, you're talking about things that have gone wrong. And to me, it seems you talk more about those things, and it's like, is it because you got away with them, or because, I mean, you don't know, oh yeah, that was a good thing that she got that prize. No, it was like, well, yeah, we got away from the police, or whatever.
Yeah.
So why? It seems like, is that what we should do now as old
Okay, so if I can just repeat the question for the benefit of people in the back. So the question was about reminiscing about things in our past, right? And whether that's a positive thing to do, or whether we should take chances now rather than reminiscing about how all the things that we escaped harm as young people. Well, when I think about my adolescence, I'm amazed I'm still alive, quite frankly. But okay, let's just talk just a little bit about the idea of reminiscing, right? One of the things that the distance of time does, it allows us to think about things conceptually, cognitively, without necessarily all of the attendant emotions coming along with it. I mean, things that were very intense in terms of their emotionality at the moment probably won't elicit the same level of intensity 20 years hence and remembering, but I still may be able to remember the things that have happened to me 20 years ago. But the potential for that is twofold, I think. One is making sense of things that at the time didn't seem to make a lot of sense. You know, I think we do a lot of crazy stuff in our lives, and to look back on that and kind of think about what the hell was I thinking about when that happened? You know, is in many ways instructive. It goes beyond just the reminiscing. I learned something about myself from that. What it does to us emotionally, I mean, certainly if we dwell on things that bring sadness, that's probably not a good thing, because that will begin to perseverate about that, at least potentially so. But I think the fact that we can remember our past and think back through past experiences, even though I have to point out that our memories for those past experiences are not high fidelity necessarily, that those interpretations often can be instructive in how we might choose to make decisions now.
And then another piece. So as we get older, our personality characteristics shift a little bit over time. They don't shift a lot, but one of the things that does happen to most people is that we get more emotionally stable over the course of our lives. So as adolescents, we really ride life's roller coaster, and there's always individual differences as to how much people do that. But as we get older, the highs and lows tend to level out a little bit, which means that as we get older, we may not feel as deeply invested in some of the things that we're doing. We may not feel as much excitement or sadness or things as we did when we were younger. So now what? Now we get together with a bunch of old friends, okay? What we want to talk about to really feel a little bit exhilarated by our past is to find some of those elements, those memories of things where we were emotionally invested in. Now here's the interesting thing. Memory tends to be biased towards negative or frightening events that happened. Why? Well, because it's a good idea to remember where the tiger was so that you don't go back to the tiger again and have it jump on you. In our evolutionary history, we don't have a lot of tigers now, but we do have the time that we got pulled over for speeding, or that time that somebody, you know, one of our friends shoplifted something and we all got chased out of the store, or whatever, you know, whatever silly thing we did when we were kids that we got away with. Now, here's the interesting thing, because over the distance of time, those things are safe now, because we didn't get caught, we lived through the experience, all we get is a little hit of that exhilaration, right? And we remember things that were slightly negative, because those are the things that stick in memory. And so part of what we're doing when we have these conversations with old friends is exhilarating ourselves a little bit through the magic of some of these memories that were somewhat negative in the past, and now are serving to kind of give us some degree of energy. Now, if we shared some intense positive experiences, those will also come back, which is why, you know, friends who played high school football or basketball together will reminisce about the game-winning shot, or that time that we beat the hated high school football rival, or something like that. I mean, those are positive memories that have the same function. But a lot of what we're doing is allowing our older self to feel at least a little bit of the roller coaster ride that we went on when we were younger.
Another question? Oh, thank you for the question, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering about long-term use of mood-altering drugs. Does it actually eventually prevent you from being able to either feel happiness or sadness?
Just to clarify, by mood-altering drugs, do you mean medications that are prescribed for things like depression?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, a couple of things.
And just to repeat the question, right?
Yeah,
The question
thank
is,
you, yeah.
does the long-term use of drugs that are intended to regulate mood or influence mood, does that long-term use affect your ability to experience emotions later?
I know this is a really crappy answer. It depends. But now I'm going to finish the sentence. It depends on what? It depends on the drug, because drugs work through different mechanisms. I mean, some drugs, like narcotics, just sort of dull pain, right? Whether it's emotional pain or physical pain. Other kinds of drugs, like Art's talking about, SSRIs and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, those kind of things, do different kinds of things to the brain that, you know, if you think about the use of many illicit drugs or using legal drugs to excess, brains are amazingly adaptable parts of our bodies, right? And as you probably know, at least in a cursory way, what happens with the chemistry of our brain, which is a lot to do with how our brain functions, is chemistry. The chemistry of our brain is based on particular chemicals being sensed by sensors in the brain. We call them receptors, but it doesn't make any difference. So there are chemicals that are sensed by things in our brain. An influx of a high extent of some kind of chemical changes the number and the functioning of many receptors. So over a long period of time, our brains will respond differently to the same thing, which is why many people who begin to use illicit drugs like cocaine and those kinds of things find that often it requires more of the drug to get the same high, because your brain has adapted to that extent of the drug in there. But you were going to say something. Go.
Oh, okay. Well, so what I was going to say also though is, it not only depends on the drug, it also depends for drugs that are being prescribed. It also depends on what the disorder is that you're just prescribing the drug for. So, for example, depression is actually an interesting disorder, because one of the standard symptoms of depression is actually what's called anhedonia, which is just a fancy way of saying not feeling much, right? So in fact, one of the things that happens when you are released from depression is that you actually feel more, right? And so in some ways, what depression drugs will do, the reason that they lift your mood isn't actually because they're lifting your mood. It's that they are actually releasing your brain to experience the highs and lows that your motivational system is trying to feed it, which are otherwise blocked by this other condition. And so in fact, often people who are prone to depression and will return to a depressed state often need to relearn how to experience their emotions, right? So it's actually in many ways the reverse of blunting your emotional response in the future, right? And similarly, anxiety is often comorbid with depression, meaning it happens along with depression for many people. The thing about anxiety is, anxiety says there's this fearful thing out in the environment I can't get away from. When you're living under the sense psychologically that you have something out there to fear, it's very hard to experience other emotions. In particular, happiness is what's called an approach axis emotion. What does that mean? It means that you experience happiness when there is a desirable thing out there in the world that you are going after and making progress towards achieving. But fear and anxiety are what are called avoidance axis emotions, which means you experience them when there's something horrible out there in the environment that you're trying to get away from. So one of the things that happens with anxiety is it makes it hard to experience any joy and satisfaction and happiness, because you're living under the sense that there's some horrible thing you have to avoid. And so those medications that are anti-anxiety can help to dull the activity of this sense that there's something to avoid, which gives you actually more opportunities to look for the potential positive things that you could actually enjoy and find happiness about. So those kinds of medications over the long term can be quite useful in helping to retrain yourself to feel more positive emotions. But as Bob was saying, some of these other kinds of drugs that will alter mood, opiates that will do that, or things like cocaine, those can actually have very different effects in their long-term use.
Yeah. So it's a complicated question, but thank you for asking the question. Yes, sir.
Do you draw a distinction between joy and happiness?
Do I personally? No. But I will say this. I see joy at my age. I keep mentioning my age because I just can't believe how old I am.
I can't believe it either.
Yeah, I know. but the thing about it is, there's a quiet to joy that's lovely that I think most young people, God, listen to me, think about joy as this elated, buoyant state, But I see there are many levels of elation in terms of joy. I mean, all the joyful things that I experience, and because I'm so into joy now, I'm really into joy. I tell my students all the time, you got to get some joy, because I look at my students, and the common response that I say that I get from my students, I say, "How's it going?" They say, "Busy," And it's not like a joyful busy. It's like busy, like, oh my God, I got this thing, and then I haven't even started this.
The world's going to end.
Yeah, I mean, it's not joyful, and I think the semantics of it. I don't know. There may be some definitional thing that somebody has as a distinction, but I think that there is a thing about experiencing joy that's an important part of human functioning. And one of the things that art says frequently, which I very much appreciate, is that we are a social species. And it seems like some of the most important experiences of joy involve interactions with other people. And we know that gratitude is an important piece of happiness, right? Is a sense of gratitude. But what's even greater than the internal sense of gratitude is expressing gratitude to other human beings with whom we interact. And often it doesn't take much to prompt somebody to do that. I mean, we're not saying you have to turn your life upside down, but call your mother and tell her you love her, and just that, And I think what happens in a very busy life in contemporary society, we wrongly think, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to go up to somebody and thank them for something they did for me today, or sometime in the past. But actually, those things take seconds often. And they have tremendous effects, not just on the person we're talking to, but on ourselves, right? I mean, we tend to think happiness is because something came to us. And we less often think of happiness as a result of things that we give to other people, when I think most people who really think about this deeply understand that that's as important a part of generating happiness as anything that comes to you.
And with that, because I just took a look at the time, I think we're getting to the end here, so I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, in keeping with what Bob just said, we are actually really grateful that you all decided to come out and hang out with us for the evening, because one of the things, Bob and I are privileged to be educators at one of the best public universities on planet Earth, the University of Texas at Austin. And we love the fact that not only lets us hang out with the undergraduates and graduate students who sit in our classes, but gives us this opportunity to come around the state and around the country to talk to people and share a little bit about what we know. So thank you for taking the time to do that. We are grateful. It gives us joy to be able to do this. So thank you very much. And then, thank you. And finally, I am the self-promotion arm of this duo. So as Bill kindly mentioned at the beginning, we together do a show called Two Guys on Your Head, which can be found as a podcast wherever podcasts can be found. So iTunes and Stitcher and all that good stuff. So check us out. It's a 7.5-minute segment, so it doesn't require a deep commitment, but there are like 150 episodes. So it can become a deep commitment if you wanted to. We also, if you don't like to listen to things, you like to read things instead, we got you covered. We have a book that came out last year called Brain Briefs that is answers to 40 random questions you never knew you needed the answer to, everything from things about happiness to why kitten videos are so awesome. And on top of that, if you look for us, Bob Duke, Art Markman, look us up and send us an email, tell us how you're doing, because we always love to hear from people that we've talked to and to let us know what went well or maybe what didn't go so well. But thanks again, we had a great time.
Great, and again, thanks again to Bill Winslade and the Moody Foundation and the Institute for Medical Humanities. Thank you so much all for coming tonight. Thank you.